Kneel, human.
I kneel to no queen.
Then you are either brave or foolish.
Come to me, human.
Why me?
Because you do not fear me.
What is happening?
They've come to kill me. And only you can keep me alive.
The reception hall on Avarice 7 had been designed by people who understood that Physical's environment was itself a form of diplomatic argument. The dome overhead cycled through homeworld atmospheric simulations at a pace calibrated to avoid motion discomfort for 6 species with rotational sensitivity issues. And every 42 minutes the light shifted into the Velhari spectrum, pale violet edged with gold, a wavelength combination that had no natural equivalent in any planetary atmosphere, which, when it fell across Queen Thesavane's coloring, made her look less like a diplomat and more like something a civilization would put in its founding myths. James Harrow had been watching this effect for 7 years and still found it, if not remarkable, then at least worth noting. He moved through 237 guests with the layered invisibility he had built over 2 very different occupations. The shock core had given him the cold kind, geometric, still, about occupying the exact angles of a space such that eyes moved across you without purchase. The way a hand moves across a smooth surface looking for something to grip and finding none. 7 years of household service had given him the warm kind, the soft projection of gentle irrelevance that caused people's minds to complete the thought-serving staff and move on before their attention had fully engaged. He had discovered, in the years since discharge, that the 2 types worked together in a way that neither would have managed individually. No guest this summit had looked directly at him since the 40-minute mark. He had tested this as a professional matter. The hall held the specific political density of an event where something large was about to change, and every person present understood this and was pretending otherwise. Humanity's admission to the Galactic Concordance had been in active diplomatic motion for 31 years. Queen Thesavane had been the primary architect of that motion for all 31 of them, which meant she had been running a 31-year campaign that required simultaneous management of 31 species, competing security concerns, 14 treaty frameworks, 4 changes of Concordance high speakership, 1 significant error in year 12 that had taken 4 years and considerable personal, political cost to correct, and the kind of sustained tension that most political careers burned to nothing before they could sustain. The summit tonight was not the finish of that work, but it was the place where 31 years of accumulated momentum finally became visible, and everyone in this hall was calculating their position in relation to what came next. Harrow set down 2 empty glasses near the window station that faced Avarice 7's solar collector array, the structures glittering against absolute black in the way space installations glittered when you had grown up on a planet with weather and had never fully made peace with the permanence of that particular darkness. He picked up 3 clean flutes. He moved east, at the pace of someone who has been doing exactly this for long enough that it requires no conscious attention, and he paused at a position that gave him sightlines to both the eastern door and the alcove where the Queen was receiving Counselor Methavash of the Durenti Collective, with the warmth she reserved for people she found necessary and slightly exhausting. The 4 figures at the eastern door had been in position since the 47-minute mark. Harrow was now at 91. Their credentials identified them as observers from the Orvanti Trade Commission, which was a real designation and would clear a standard scan without difficulty. What a standard scan would not detect was badge frequency 2 kilocycles, off commission standard, a discrepancy Harrow had memorized to catch because 7 months ago a commission delegation had attended the preliminary treaty talks, and he had run background on every attendee as a matter of professional practice that had nothing to do with his formal responsibilities. The Orvanti were trilateral, and their weight distribution produced a distinctive way of standing that was meaningfully different from bilateral species. These 4 were bilateral under their formal robes. None of them had touched food or drink in the 51 minutes since he'd first noted them. Their visual scanning patterns moved in coordinated arcs-trained behavior, not natural curiosity. And when he had positioned himself at their peripheral edges 3 times over the course of the evening to confirm his assessment, Not one of them had tracked him. This last detail he had spent a moment thinking about. They had already categorized him domestic service staff, non-threatening, not a priority, and had removed him from their active attention model. It was efficient threat assessment. It was, from the position of someone who had spent 4 years learning that the most dangerous thing in any room was the thing that had been assessed as not dangerous, also something close to a gift. He moved to the Queen. She was bringing her exchange with Methavash to a close with the graceful diminuendo she used for conversations that had yielded what she needed. Harrow bent to refill her glass in the unhurried way she preferred, the movement smooth and deliberate without being servile, and he positioned the tray and his own posture in the way that created a pocket of natural conversational privacy, the kind that existed in busy rooms when two people's proximity suggested a brief exchange between principal and staff. He calibrated his voice to reach her ears and stop before they reached the Durenti, second delegate 4 feet to her left. "I counted 4 of them at the door before you saw any of them," he said. He poured steadily. "That's not something a servant learns. That's something a soldier never forgets." She did not look at him. She accepted the glass, turned it once in her fingers. He had cataloged that gesture in year 1. She turned things when integrating new information into an existing calculation, not when she was genuinely surprised. The two physical responses were different, and she could not entirely suppress either. "I know, James," she said. He waited. The glass turned again, a quarter rotation. She looked toward the eastern wall. The look on her face was the one he had seen twice in 7 years of close proximity, controlled anticipation, running under a surface of absolute composure. The expression she wore when something she had arranged was arriving on the schedule she'd intended. Both previous times, something of very large consequence had happened within the hour. He was standing close enough to her to read this with confidence. He was close enough to her to read most things with confidence, which was not incidental to his usefulness. "Let them proceed," she said. The heartbeat in which he processed this was exactly as long as a heartbeat. "Your Majesty, you heard me." "I did." He straightened, took the empty glass from the surface beside her. "Then I'll continue with my duties. You have always been very good at your duties." James, the weight she put into this was not quite warmth and not quite command and not quite apology. It was the tone of someone trusting another person with something consequential while withholding the details, because the details would require the other person to make a choice, and she could not afford to have them make a different one than the one she needed. He moved away. He did not look toward the door. He went to the service corridor and stood in the recycled air quiet for 4 seconds, which was all he could spare and all he needed. He performed an inventory. 7 years in Velhari household service. 2 years before that in the Corps to Civilian Employment Transition Program, which had matched him with the Velhari household. Posting through a referral chain he had never fully traced and suspected was less accidental than it appeared. 4 years before that with the 7th Squad, Shock Corps, 3rd Human Expeditionary Force. In the Kadrith engagement at the fortress, the Kadrith called Velkath, and the Corps had eventually called in mission reports, simply the breach entering at 12, leaving at 1. He had been the one. He had spent 9 subsequent years in the specific, deliberate project of converting that fact from present tense to history, and had made what he considered real progress. He was good at his job now, not in the compensatory way he'd feared when he'd taken the most domestic position he could find. He had been prepared, going in, to be very bad at it and to do it anyway, because the distance was the point, but authentically good, in the way that came from discovering that the attention to detail, the habit of anticipating requirements before they were stated, the capacity to be genuinely useful in a space without dominating it. These were things he'd always had. The Corps had honed them into a particular instrument. Household service had honed them into a different one. He respected his work. He respected the woman he served, and had for years, and found that the combination of useful service and genuine respect was a satisfying arrangement in a way he had not expected, and had taken some time to feel comfortable admitting. The Queen had said, "Let them proceed." He took his white gloves off, put them in his jacket pocket, and went back out. The 4 figures had the Queen in a coordinated perimeter, moving her toward the eastern exit with the smooth, professional, measured pressure of people who had done this before in watched rooms. She was still talking as they moved, maintaining the social contract. keeping the surrounding witnesses reading the situation as unremarkable, a technique she deployed when she needed to move through a space under observation without triggering alarm responses. The crowd parted ahead of the group in the unconscious way. Crowds parted for people who moved with certainty. Her expression held exactly the right level of late-evening diplomatic pleasantry. She was, to the room, a queen being attended from one reception event to the next. One of the four ran a visual scan toward the service corridor. Harrow was at the western side of the hall, with his tray level, his chin at the angle, his weight at the distribution the Corps had called furniture position, the specific geometry that caused the eye to process you as part of the environment rather than an element of it requiring attention. The scan crossed him and moved on. He was still the butler. He was still the harmless domestic staff who had been assessed and dismissed at some point in the first 47 minutes. He did not revise this assessment. He went through the western service alcove, into the maintenance channel behind the west wall. Low ceiling, recycled coolant smell, emergency floor lighting. He had walked this route 3 weeks ago when the advanced preparation team arrived for the summit, spending his first full afternoon on every service infrastructure channel and access hatch on his level of the station. He had done this in every significant posting for 7 years. And before that, for 4 more years in context where the consequences of not knowing a room's service infrastructure were considerably more immediate. His current employers attributed this practice to admirable professionalism. He had never corrected the attribution. The channel brought him to the docking arm corridor ahead of the group. He took position in the equipment shadows at the corridor's eastern end, with clear sightlines to the private docking bay 40 meters ahead. The ship there was mid-class freight, common enough in commercial lanes to avoid routine scrutiny, large enough for discreet personnel transport, almost certainly registered under different names and different port systems to exploit the Concordance's 48-hour registration processing lag. He identified this as Vreth Syndicate operational pattern from the briefings he'd read 8 months ago when the syndicate first appeared flagged as an outer territory concern, had flagged them back in the Queen's security assessments, had been told politely that summit security was the station's responsibility. He had continued monitoring independently, because that was also reflex. Queen Thessavane walked up the boarding ramp between the 4 figures. At the top she turned and looked back at the station, and her eyes went directly to the equipment shadow where Harrow was standing. The precision of it was the precision of someone who had known exactly where he would be, because she understood his habits and had accounted for them. She pressed something in her palm, small, silver, unmistakably Vilhari diplomatic chip format, held it at chest height for 2 seconds, and then folded her hand and walked inside. She had given him this same chip 3 weeks ago. He had been carrying it in his inner pocket since then. Assuming it was sensitive material, she wanted him to hold for safekeeping, which was not unusual. She had given him no instructions about it. He had not asked, because she did not always explain immediately, and because he trusted her professional judgment in the way that 7 years of watching good professional judgment operate created trust, he thought. Standing in the equipment shadow, watching the boarding ramp retract, about what it meant that she had held the chip up so he could see it and identify it. She was confirming that the one he'd been carrying for 3 weeks was the relevant item. She was telling him, without words, because there was no time and no mechanism for words. You have the thing. You know what it looks like. Don't lose it. The docking clamps began their release. He was through the service hatch before the 3rd clamp disengaged. The maintenance shaft to the secondary freight arm was a 60-meter crawl at pace. Memory and emergency floor strips and the angle of the station's floor plan he'd memorized on that first afternoon doing most of the navigation. He emerged below the secondary arm, went up the exterior access ladder into the noise and warmth of the thrusters, cycling up for departure. The heat displacement above the thruster mounts was considerable. His eyes were streaming by the top of the ladder. He found the cargo bay's emergency mooring cleat by touch alone, a standard fitting on mid-class Concordance-licensed freight, located in a standardized position on the underside of all cargo bays per registration requirements, pulled himself flush with the hull, found the exterior override panel, and had the cargo bay open in 31 seconds. Concordance safety regulations mandated exterior emergency access to all licensed cargo bays. for the recorded historical reason that docking accidents produced sealed bays with people inside them. He had read regulation in a station safety briefing in year 2 of his service and had spent roughly 30 seconds thinking about its implications for specific hypothetical situations before filing it and moving on. He pulled himself in, sealed the bay, lay on the floor in the dark while the ship undocked and the adrenaline ran its course, which took about 75 seconds and was managed by the same method he'd always used. Let it happen. Don't fight it. Be functional on the other side. The ship entered transit burn. The stars through the single small viewport stretched into lines and disappeared. He sat up. He inventoried the cargo bay by touch and by the memory of its dimensions from the gap in the docking arm he'd seen before boarding. 16 crates in 4 rows, machine components and textiles. Per the manifest strips he felt along the crate edges. 1 overhead light on a motion sensor. 1 forward access hatch. 1 viewport. Single pane. Minimal insulation. Floor temperature somewhere around 15 degrees. He found the overhead sensor's access panel in the ceiling, pulled the connection in 6 minutes, and made himself a sleeping arrangement from textile bolts in the gap behind the rear crate row. Then he reached into his inner jacket pocket. He held the chip in his palm. Velhari high encryption diplomatic format. He'd handled enough of them in his capacity as household coordinator that he recognized it immediately. It was inactive in his hand. Without a reader, he couldn't determine whether it was locked, or whether it had already transmitted whatever it was designed to transmit, or whether it was waiting for a condition he didn't understand. He turned it over twice. He held it toward the viewport transit blur. No light. Useless. He put it back in his pocket. He lay in the dark on textile bolts and thought. He had entered this cargo bay with no backup, no authorization, no plan beyond stay undiscovered until arrival, then assess. He was also employed as a butler. He held these 2 facts in parallel and found the gap between them clarifying rather than absurd. It clarified the nature of the situation. It clarified what the Queen had done and what she had not told him she was doing. It clarified that the next several days were going to require him to be something he had spent 7 years carefully not being. He thought about let them proceed and the look on her face. He thought about the chip held up on the ramp, the deliberate confirmation. He thought about 3 weeks of carrying something without explanation from a woman who was meticulous about explaining operational parameters for everything she needed from him, which meant that this time the explanation was the one thing she could not afford to give him. Because if he had understood what he was carrying, he would have made a different decision, and she needed him to make this specific one. He was going to have a considerable amount to say about this. When he found her, he closed his eyes. What the situation required was rest, and he had learned, in a context considerably more demanding than this one, to prioritize what the situation required over what his mind would prefer to occupy itself with at 2 in the morning, on a hostile vessel in transit to an unknown location. He slept. He woke twice during transit. Once at crew voices in the corridor outside, a standing disagreement between 2 people, resolved within 5 minutes, and once at the ship's automated systems check cycle, running through the cargo bay door's external sensors. He cataloged both, confirmed his own concealment and the status of the access panel he'd disabled, and went back to sleep. The deceleration burn woke him, properly and finally, 11 hours after departure. He was on his feet before the burn had ended. From crew sound patterns during his waking intervals, he placed the crew complement at 9 to 12. From the pressure distribution in the floor, during the forward systems, cycles mid-class freight vessels reinforced their central service corridor, decking in a pattern that was detectable through the soles of your feet if you knew what you were feeling for. And he knew, because he had spent 4 years running operations on vessels of this class, and the pattern was one of the first things the Corps had made you memorize. The
forward access
hatch connected to the main service corridor with cruise spaces beyond it. He found the ship's destination on the cargo management terminal. Concordance safety standards required unauthenticated cargo terminal access for port inspection purposes, and this regulation had never struck him as quite as purely administrative as it was presumably intended to be. Nareth Station, outer territory, non-concordance registered space. He'd read about Nareth Station. He'd looked up its publicly available structural data 8 months ago as a private professional exercise. In the way he'd approached every location that appeared in security briefings with sufficient recurrence to warrant closer attention. Hub and spoke configuration. Approximately 400 meters primary diameter. Rotating gravity in the outer ring. 6 spoke corridors connecting outer ring to central hub. Security infrastructure concentrated at the hub approaches. The Queen would be in the hub. He would need the spoke corridors. He thought about the kind of person who spent 8 months preparing for situation while telling no one they had prepared, who lay in a dark cargo bay 11 hours from everything familiar and felt, underneath the calculation and the cold discipline, something recognizable, he thought. We are, in some ways, exactly alike. He found a position in the second textile crate, the one he'd partially hollowed for this purpose during the 3-hour period after his second waking, and waited for the noise and movement of cargo offloading to give him cover. When the ship clamped to Nareth Station and the crew shifted into transfer routine, Harrow went through the forward hatch during the 40-second window when both cargo review crew members were occupied at the forward manifest station, moved through 2 junctions on the outer service ring by the emergency maintenance route marked on every Concordance licensed installation, and was in Nareth Station's outer maintenance corridor before the ship had finished its undocking sequence. The station smelled of machine oil and long recycled air. The rotation of the outer ring produced a gravity signature fractionally heavier than standard, a characteristic of older centrifugal installations running at the low end of their RPM tolerance that he registered in his feet and lower back and added to his positional data. He stood still and listened to the station, the mechanical hum of rotation, the air processor cycle, the rhythm of a regular crew movement pattern in the spoke corridor to his north. He reached into his pocket and held the chip for a moment, in the dark, in the recycled oil air. He thought about what was on it. He thought about what she had built and what she had not told him and what she needed him to be for the next several hours. Then he put the chip away, confirmed that his service gloves were on, and began to learn the station. The first thing Harrow did in Nareth Station's outer maintenance ring was nothing. He stood against the wall of the corridor, breathing at rest rate, and he listened for 4 full minutes. Not for threats, specifically for the rhythm. Every installation had one, a pattern in the sound and vibration of its operations that told you where people moved, and at what intervals and with what regularity. Nareth's outer ring had the rhythm of a place that had been running the same operational protocols for long enough that nobody thought about them anymore, which was the best kind of rhythm for someone who needed to move without being noticed. The crew rotation was regular. The maintenance check cycle was predictable. The variance in foot traffic between the northeast and southwest spoke corridors suggested that the northeast spoke led somewhere more operationally important, and that the southwest corridor was lower priority. He filed this. He began to move. He had, from memory, the following assets. Nareth Station's publicly available structural schematic, which had been filed with Concordance Border Monitoring 6 years ago as part of the Outer Territory Installation Registration process that the syndicate had used as cover for an installation that was substantially not what it had been registered as. The registered schematic would not be entirely accurate. Organizations using commercial registration as cover always modified the infrastructure in ways they did not file, but the structural elements would be close. Because you could not change the load-bearing architecture without undertaking work that would be visible from the exterior, and the exterior was observable. He had studied the exterior from 3 separate imagery sources during the 8 months since he'd first flagged Nareth in the security briefings. The spoke corridors would be in approximately the right places. The hub's configuration would be roughly accurate. The security infrastructure would be where the structural weight concentrated, because security infrastructure was heavy and you built it where the floor could hold it. From the data chip in his pocket, he knew nothing. He had no reader. He could not access it. He was carrying something he could not examine, in a location he only partially understood, looking for a person whose plan he did not know. And he had been placed in this situation deliberately by the person whose plan he did not know. He was aware that this was, from a certain angle, a remarkably high level of professional trust. He was also aware that it was, from another angle, infuriating. He set this aside, because the situation required him to be functional rather than infuriated, and being infuriated at a situation you were already inside did not constitute a useful operational posture. He found an access point to the station's primary maintenance network, the infrastructure that ran heating, ventilation, electrical distribution, and the fire suppression system throughout the installation in a utility junction 40 meters into the outer ring, behind a panel that was locked with a standard concordance format maintenance key that would open with a specific 3-tool sequence he had memorized from the licensing documentation 8 months ago. It took 4 minutes. He was in. The maintenance network gave him access to the station's mechanical systems without requiring him to enter the main corridors. More importantly, it gave him access to the environmental control registers for every section of the station, which told him, among other things, which sections had active thermal loads, which meant people, which meant occupied spaces, and at what intensities. He spent 40 minutes in the utility junction, reading the environmental registers and building a picture. The hub section of the station had the heaviest thermal load, approximately 35 to 40 people in a space designed for about 20, cramped. Security deployments always ran cramped in the hub because you concentrated your forces there, which had the secondary effect of making the spokes comparatively lighter. The northeast spoke was the primary transit corridor, 6 to 8 people moving through it at any given time, and the southwest spoke was the secondary route used primarily for supply movement. The outer ring's residential sections held about 15 more personnel, dispersed. Total, approximately 50 to 55 people on the station, of which 43 were listed as security personnel in the border, monitoring submissions, and 12 were unlisted and therefore almost certainly either command staff or specialized personnel. The Queen was in the hub. He was fairly certain of this based on the thermal load concentration and the security deployment pattern. High-value detainees went to the highest security zone, which was the hub, because that was the point of hub security. He began disabling guards. He did not call it that. In his mind, he called it reducing the number, which was more precise. The Corps had drilled the distinction. You were not fighting. You were solving a problem, and the problem was a number, and you were reducing the number through whatever means were available to you that would hold the reduction in place for long enough to reach your objective. Fighting was expensive. Reducing a number was efficient. The difference was operational posture, which determined whether you reached your objective or spent your available resources before you got there. The maintenance network gave him access to air handling for individual sections. It gave him control over the lighting circuits. It gave him the fire suppression system's manual override ports at 11 points throughout the installation, which meant 11 locations where he could create controlled environmental events that would draw personnel responses and concentrate attention in the wrong places. He identified 4 guards in the outer ring who operated on a rotation that took each one through an isolated section, a brief, regular interval of solitude that occurred at the same time in each 40-minute cycle. He timed them. He confirmed the intervals. He moved through the maintenance access and entered each isolated section during the relevant interval and reduced the number by 4. He was efficient. The Corps had not emphasized gentleness in its training, but Harrow had spent 7 years not killing people, and he was not going to start now because a criminal organization had made a strategic error with his employer. The 4 guards were unconscious and secured in positions where they would remain undiscovered through at least 2 rotation cycles. He had used nothing that was not already present in the maintenance junction or on his person as part of a standard household kit. He had made no noise. He had left nothing out of place. He had been in the station for 6 hours when he found the first terminal that could read the environmental data in enough detail to tell him something new. One of the hub's intersections had a thermal signature inconsistent with security personnel, lighter, more sedentary, a single person in a space sized for 4, running a constant low-level thermal load that suggested comfortable captivity rather than operational detention. A chair, a bed, good air circulation. The Queen was probably there. He filed this. He moved back into the maintenance network and continued. The Vreth Syndicate operated, in Commander Voreth's estimation, with the efficiency of an organization that had been successful at this type of operation for long enough to have developed genuine competence. Vorath had been running the Syndicate's political leverage division for 11 years, which meant 11 years of asset acquisition. 11 years of reading what high-value targets required and what their absence could extract. And 11 years of successfully completing operations that the Concordance's official security apparatus had no framework for addressing. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a person who made mistakes. He was, at the moment, in the hub's command center, reporting to Counselor Sethris of the Galactic Concordance on an encrypted channel, and the report was proceeding exactly as planned. "The Queen is secure and unharmed," Vorath said. He was a large bilateral figure with the gray-violet coloring of the Vreth species' northern clades, and he carried himself with the particular authority of someone who had learned that authority resided mostly in posture and certainty, and that intelligence alone, deployed at sufficient confidence, was usually indistinguishable from justified intelligence. "She has been informed of our requirements. She has not yet agreed to sign the abdication document, but she will. They always assess their options for us before they accept that options ours are limited." Counselor Sethris's image on the encrypted display was small and precise, the image of a being who had held the same concordance seat for 40 years and had learned to operate in the specific way that 40 years of political survival required. "The summit's recess was accepted as a procedural matter," Sethris said. "The Velhari delegation is managing the situation internally. No security response has been initiated." A pause. "What about the butler?" Vorath allowed himself the brief satisfaction of a thoroughly irrelevant question. "He fled before the doors closed. Station security has no record of him attempting to contact Concordance authorities. Footage from Averis 7 shows him leaving through a maintenance channel approximately 4 minutes after we boarded." He shrugged, a Vreth gesture that communicated dismissal. "He's human. They aren't equipped, psychologically or otherwise, for this type of event. Even their military personnel break under sudden isolation and loss of support structure. A domestic servant would be significantly more fragile." On the other end of the channel, a Counselor Sethris said nothing for a moment. Then, "Ensure the abdication document is signed within 48 hours. The summit's recess window is not indefinite." "Understood." Vorath closed the channel and turned to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Yasha Dren, who had been standing at the far side of the command center during the communication, with her characteristic stillness that Vorath had always read as attentiveness and which was actually, though he did not know this, a specific kind of listening. "Is there anything in the outer ring I should know about?" Dren was younger than Vorath and slightly less experienced and considerably more careful about the gap between what she knew and what she assumed. She had been reviewing the environmental monitoring data for the past hour in a way that she had not yet been able to articulate to herself as concern, but which occupied something in the back of her mind with a steady, low-level attention she could not dismiss. 2 guards from the eastern outer rotation checked in late during the most recent cycle," she said, "by about 12 minutes. This has not happened before in the 14 months this installation has been operational at current staffing. Equipment issue. Most likely. This station runs old systems." "Possibly," Dren said. She looked at the environmental monitor again. She looked at the 2 rotation positions that had checked in late, and the specific isolation intervals in those positions' patrol routes. And she thought about a question she did not yet have enough data to ask coherently. "I'll run a physical check. It's probably the Eastern Ring's ventilation system. It cycles irregularly in cold sectors." Vorath was already moving on to the next item on his operational list. "Don't spend resources on it. We're focused on the hub timeline." Dren said understood and did not move toward the Eastern Ring immediately, because she was thinking. She was thinking about the butler. She was thinking about the 47-second gap in the Averis 7 security footage, a gap that had been attributed to a known camera system glitch that occurred intermittently, in which the footage of the maintenance channel exit simply did not exist. She had read the Averis 7 security report herself and had noted the gap and had thought, camera glitch, probably, and had then thought, or not, and had then thought about what or not would mean if the butler was the kind of person whose absence from 47 seconds of footage was deliberate rather than coincidental. She did not have enough to bring to Vorath. She went to run the physical check in the outer ring's eastern sector, in the maintenance corridor, adjacent to the utility junction where Harrow had spent the past 6 hours. A guard regained consciousness against a wall and found his hands secured behind him and his comm unit removed, and did not, for a long moment, understand what had happened to him. The last thing he remembered was the corridor being empty. Then there had been, he worked at the memory, couldn't make it sharper. A pressure from a very specific angle, applied with a precision that suggested detailed anatomical knowledge. And then there had been nothing. He had served in the Vreth Syndicate for 4 years, had participated in 9 previous extractions of this type, and had never once been left secured in a utility junction by something he had not seen enter the corridor. He lay against the wall in the maintenance channel's recycled oil air and tried to remember if the pressure had come from above or from the side, and could not. And this troubled him in a way he could not entirely articulate. And he began very quietly trying to work his wrists free from the conduit ties. Down the corridor, past the junction he was in and through, another maintenance hatch, and into the ventilation shaft that ran along the inner face of the outer ring's north section. James Harrow moved toward the first spoke corridor. He was methodical. He was patient in the way that a man could be patient when patience was the only available approach, and when impatience cost you everything. He had been awake for approximately 18 hours, had reduced the outer ring's guard count by 4, and had confirmed the Queen's probable location. He had not yet encountered a situation that required him to be anything other than what he had been for the past 7 years, which was a very good domestic professional with an unusually detailed knowledge of his employer's security environment. He was aware that this was going to change. He was also aware, and this was the thing he held in his mind with a specific kind of care, the same care with which you hold something very old and somewhat fragile, that he had been in this mode before, in far worse conditions, and had come out the other side. The 7th squad had gone into Velkath with 12 people, and the Kadrith had anticipated 12 threats and had defended against 12 threats. And the number 11 had come apart, because 11 was not 12, and the subtraction had not been clean, and the one that remained had kept moving. He kept moving. He reached the northeast spoke's maintenance shaft access at the 22-hour mark since his departure from Avara 7, and he stopped. And he looked at his hands for a moment in the dim light of the emergency floor strips. They were shaking, not badly, not visibly, probably at any useful distance. A fine motor tremor in the last joints of his fingers and the inner tendons of his wrists. The tremor of someone who had not eaten in 22 hours and had been operating at this level of controlled physical and cognitive stress for too long. He had felt this before, in a different context. He had felt it on day 3 at Velkath, standing in a corridor with 11 people behind him and a fortress ahead of him, and the full weight of what he was about to be asked to do pressing down from all directions at once. The tremor then had been worse, more fundamental, more honest about the situation, and it had stopped. Not because the situation had gotten better, but because at a certain point, the part of you that could shake had exhausted itself, and the part of you that could not shake had taken over. He watched his hands. He waited. The tremor ran out after about 90 seconds, and his hands went still. He looked at them, still in the dim light, for a moment. The stillness was familiar. It was the stillness of something settling into position, a thing that had been waiting in a specific location for a long time and had now been found and acknowledged. He had missed it. In the years of table settings and diplomatic receptions, he had not wanted to miss it. He had not wanted to acknowledge that it was a thing one could miss. He would think about what this meant later, when there was time for the thinking to be useful rather than just honest. He opened the spoke access hatch and went in. By the 30-hour mark, the number was 31. Harrow had worked through the outer ring, the northeast spoke, and 3 sections of the hub's outer layer with the systematic efficiency of someone solving a geometry problem in the dark. The method was the same throughout. Read the environment. Identify the isolated intervals. Reduce the number in the isolated interval. Secure the result. Continue. He was not moving faster than the problem could support, and he was not moving slower than the timeline required. And the balance between these 2 constraints was the specific discipline the Corps had spent 4 years installing in him, and which he had spent 9 subsequent years telling himself he had moved past. He had, apparently, not moved past it. He was still capable of running this calculation to several decimal places in a darkened maintenance shaft, while assessing the ventilation pattern for the section ahead and thinking about the environmental register data that suggested the Queen was in the hub's inner section C. The station had not yet registered the reduction. Dren's physical check had found the first 2 empty patrol positions and had escalated to Vorath, who had concluded equipment fault or personnel error and had sent a search team to the outer ring. The search team had found nothing. They had found nothing specifically because Harrow had moved the secured guards to the inner face of the outer ring's maintenance crawlspace, behind the secondary water recycler, which was not a location that a reasonable outer ring search would cover. He had made this decision 3 hours before the search team was deployed because he had estimated the timeline for escalation and had positioned accordingly. He stopped in the ventilation shaft above Section C7 of the hub and listened. The Queen's voice came up through the grate below him clearly enough to read. She was speaking to someone, a guard, from the response patterns, who seemed to be posting at the cell door rather than inside the room itself, which was standard for high-value diplomatic detainees when the detaining party wanted to maintain the fiction of comfort rather than imprisonment. The room below had good air, a table, a chair, a bed, and one person who was not using any of them in the way they were intended to be used. Because Queen Thessavane of the Velhari did not sit in chairs in the way that people who felt their situation was fundamentally uncertain sat in chairs. She sat in them the way she sat in every chair she had ever sat in, which was with the spine of a person who had been sitting in important chairs for 211 years and had decided, at some point in the early portion of that 211 years, that how you sat was itself a form of position. "When do you expect the butler to be found?" she was asking. The guard outside the door, male voice, Vreth accent, the inflection pattern of someone who had received a specific answer to this question already and was now being asked to repeat it, said, "Commander Vorath's assessment is that the butler left the station before we departed. He's not expected to be a factor." "I see," the Queen said. "And what was the basis of Commander Vorath's assessment?" A pause. "He's human, ma'am, and domestic staff." "Yes," the Queen said. There was a quality to her voice that Harrow, listening from above, recognized as the quality she used when she was being given information she already knew and was allowing the person delivering it to feel that they had communicated something useful. "He is human, and he is domestic staff. Tell me, did Commander Vorath happen to look at the security footage from my arrival at Avaris 7 before the summit? Not the footage of the reception hall, the footage from the outer maintenance ring, specifically the service channel that runs to the secondary docking arm." Another pause. "Longer. I'm not aware of that footage, ma'am. There are 47 seconds of it missing," she said. "The station attributed it to a camera glitch. It is not a camera glitch." She turned something in her hands. He could hear the movement, the deliberate rotation, and then set it down. "I mention this only as a point of information. The commander may find it useful to know, or he may not." A pause. "In any case, I appreciate the company. The room is comfortable, and I have no complaints about the catering. Please convey that to whoever is responsible." Harrow lay in the ventilation shaft above Section C7 and listened to this, and he thought about what it meant. She was not afraid. He had known this from the beginning. She had not been afraid at the reception, had not been afraid on the ramp, and the voice coming up through the grate below him was not afraid now. But he had been maintaining a background assumption that the lack of fear was a performance, a diplomatic technique, the projection of composure she was capable of projecting, regardless of her internal state. He had seen her project composure in situations where the internal state was not calm at all. He was good enough at reading her, after 7 years, to catch the gap between the projection and the reality in most circumstances. But the voice coming through the grate was not doing that. There was no gap to catch. She was not performing composure. She was actually composed, and the remark about the 47-second footage gap, delivered as a passing observation, was the remark of a person who wanted the people around her to begin understanding that a variable they had dismissed was not, in fact, dismissible. She was laying groundwork. She was managing information in a space where she had very little control of anything else. She was, in other words, still working. He moved down through the ventilation shaft, identified the inner service access for C7's adjacent maintenance corridor, and confirmed his count. 31 down, 12 remaining in the hub's active security ring, plus Vorath and 3 command staff figures, plus the Queen's cell guard. His approach to the inner hub had to come through the spoke's service infrastructure, and the service infrastructure narrowed at the hub boundary in a way that made it possible, but not comfortable. He had two options. Go through the hub's primary maintenance shaft, which was wide enough, but which connected directly to the environmental control room that had 2 personnel in it at all times. Or go through the fire suppression system's secondary network, which was narrower and required him to collapse himself into positions that his lower back was going to complain about afterward, but which connected to the inner hub's access corridors without crossing any staffed space. He went through the fire suppression network. It was approximately 70 meters of narrow horizontal transit, 3 direction changes, 2 pressure valve housings that he navigated with his face 6 inches from the inner wall and his arms aligned flat to his sides, and 1 junction where the network crossed a primary structural brace that he had to move over in a specific sequence to avoid vibrating the brace against the hub's interior wall at a frequency that would carry into the hub spaces as audible sound. He had worked out the sequence from the structural data in the public registration schematic and had confirmed it during his first hour in the maintenance network. It took him 38 minutes to cover 70 meters. He did not hurry. Hurrying was how you made sounds. He came out in the inner hub's access corridor at the 32-hour mark, in a section that the environmental registers had shown as unoccupied for the previous 4 hours. He stood in the corridor and breathed and let his lower back communicate its complaints, which it did at length, and then he took stock. He was 12 meters from section C7. Between him and the cell door were 3 active security positions, 2 in the main corridor, 1 at the corner junction that gave access to C7's approach. He had neutralized 31. He needed to address 3 more before he could reach the door. After the door, there was the cell guard, and then there was whatever room the Queen was in. And then there was going to be a conversation. He thought about the conversation. He thought about what she would say. He thought about what he would say. He thought about the chip in his inner pocket that he had been carrying for 3 weeks without understanding what it was, and about what let them proceed meant in light of everything he had observed in the past 32 hours, and about what it said about his employer that she had built a plan of this scope and complexity and had chosen, as one of its necessary components, to not tell him what the plan was. He found that he did not have a clean position on this. He understood, on one level, why she had done it. If he had known she was arranging her own extraction through a sequence that required him to walk into a hostile installation alone, he would have argued. He would have argued with genuine, professional conviction. She had assessed, correctly, that she could not afford for him to argue, and so she had arranged the situation such that he arrived at the choice point without prior notice. Because at the choice point itself, standing in a cargo bay with her data chip in his pocket and a hostile ship in transit ahead of him, argument was not available, and so he had simply proceeded. He understood it. He did not, entirely, feel comfortable with it. He was not sure he was supposed to feel comfortable with it. He was not sure she was expecting him to feel comfortable with it. He thought that the conversation on the other side of the cell door was going to be, in its quiet way, one of the more significant ones he had ever had. He moved to the corner junction. Lieutenant Yasha Dren had spent the past 8 hours thinking about a problem she could not quite make explicit. She had found the 2 outer ring guards in the secondary maintenance crawlspace behind the water recycler, where a reasonable outer ring search would never look. And she had brought this to Vorath. And Vorath had concluded that someone aboard the station had a personal of his security personnel, and that the crawlspace incident was internal rather than external. Dren had thought, possibly, she had gone back to her station and had pulled the environmental monitoring data for the entire previous 24 hours. She had found 4 thermal anomalies in the outer ring that were too brief to trigger the monitoring system's attention flags and too regular to be coincidental. She had pulled the full outer ring patrol check-in log, 12 guards unaccounted for, across a time span that ran from the transit's arrival to the present. 12. She had sat with this number for some time. She had thought about what 12 meant. Deployed over 32 hours in a 400-meter installation with a comprehensive security system and 43 trained personnel. It did not mean one person. One person did not do 12 in 32 hours in this environment. It meant either a significant internal defection, which was possible, though the syndicate's vetting process was not weak, or something from outside. which meant something from the ship they'd arrived on, which meant the transit gap in the security footage, which meant she had gone to Vorath with the full analysis. He had listened with the attention of someone who was genuinely considering what they were hearing. He had said, "You're describing one person doing the work of a trained infiltration team in an environment they've never been in, using nothing but what was available in the maintenance infrastructure. That's not a domestic servant." "Dren, no," she said. "It's not." He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said something that she would remember later, in a different context, when the meaning of it had become clearer. "What do we know about the shock core?" She had run the data. It was not easy to find, not because it was classified, but because it was old. And the documentation was in formats that required specific archive access. And because the Kadrith War had ended 15 years ago, and the people who had been involved in it on the galactic side had mostly moved on to other concerns. What she found, in the archive pull she completed over the following hour, was this: the 7th Squad, Shock Corps, 3rd Human Expeditionary Force, had entered the Kadrith fortress of Velkath at 12 personnel with a mission to breach the fortress's inner command structure, and had held the fortress against Kadrith counter-assault 207 Kadrith military personnel by the Concordance's post-engagement survey for 31 hours until Concordance relief forces arrived. The engagement had produced 11 human fatalities and 1 survivor. The survivor's name was in the classified portion of the record. The classified portion was not accessible on Nareth Station's terminal. She would not have the name. She would have a great deal of other information. "Commander," she said, "I recommend we secure the Queen, immediately move her to the hub's inner chamber with full guard deployment, and that we initiate full station lockdown. I also recommend you contact Counselor Sethris to update the timeline." Vorath looked at the data she'd pulled. He was not, at this moment, expressing the dismissal he had expressed 12 hours ago on the subject of the human butler. His expression was the expression of someone who had been operating on a confident assumption and was now recalculating. "You think one person did all of this?" "I think one person from the shock corps did all of this," she said, "which is a different thing." Vorath moved quickly, which was to his credit. He put the alert on station channels, moved 3 additional guards to the Queen's corridor, and began the lockdown sequence. The environmental monitors went to active scanning. Every door in the hub went to coded access. In the inner hub's access corridor, Harrow heard the lockdown signal and noted the change in the environmental pressure pattern, which was the sound of doors sealing in a sequence that moved from outer to inner. He had 3 security positions between him and C7's approach. He had, at most, 90 seconds before those 3 positions would be joined by others. He did the calculation in the time it took to take 2 steps, confirmed the answer, and moved. He went through the first 2 positions in 40 seconds. The third heard him coming, because at this point he was moving faster than silence allowed, and turned. And Harrow took him at an angle that minimized the window between encounter and resolution. He was not casual about it. He was not violent in excess of what was required, which was a discipline that had taken 4 years to build and that had remained in him through 9 years of domestic employment without any particular maintenance. Some things, once installed, did not require reinstallation. He was outside C7's cell door at the 32-hour and 44-minute mark. The cell guard had heard something and was at alert. The cell door was coded. The cell guard had the code and a sidearm and the wall behind him and no cover. Harrow had the maintenance access panel on the wall beside the door, which he'd noted on his way through the fire suppression network, and which gave access to the door's electrical connection. Because cell doors in installations like this one were almost always on the same circuit as the environmental controls, because the people who built them prioritized integration over security compartmentalization. He pulled the panel, found the connection, and isolated the door from its code lock. The door unlatched. He pushed it open, dealt with the cell guard through the narrowing of the door frame in a way that used the door frame itself as a significant advantage, and entered the room. Queen Thessavane was standing. She had been standing before the door opened, which meant she had heard the sequence in the corridor and had understood what it meant. She was dressed as she had been at the reception, the deep ocean blue gown, unchanged, because she had been taken with nothing else, and she looked at him from across a room that smelled of fresh air and good catering, as she had mentioned, and her expression was not relief. And it was not surprise, and it was not the expression of a woman who had been waiting for rescue. It was the expression of a woman whose plan had arrived at its designated checkpoint on schedule. "James," she said. "Your Majesty," he said. He moved to the corridor side of the cell door and checked the approach. Clear for now. He had minutes. Not longer. Vorath's lockdown would redirect personnel, and the sound of what had happened at the cell door would carry. "We need to move." "Yes," she agreed. She came to the door with the smooth, unhurried ease of someone who had been expecting to leave and had been mentally prepared for the practicalities. Through the northeast spoke. He stopped. He looked at her. He thought about what she had just said, which was the name of the egress route he had selected based on 6 hours of environmental analysis of a station she had never visited, delivered as though she already knew what he would choose. "The fire suppression network is too narrow for comfort on the way back," she said, meeting his look without deflection. "The northeast spoke has a service access that connects directly to the outer ring's secondary docking arm. There's a vessel registered to a Concordance Diplomatic Support franchise docked there. The access code is on the data chip." She paused. "Which you've been carrying for 3 weeks. The alarm on the station's internal channels changed tone. Vorath had found the cell. "We have approximately 4 minutes before hub security reaches this corridor," she said. He turned and moved into the corridor, and she followed him without hesitation. At the pace he set, in the direction he chose, which was the northeast spoke's maintenance access, and she kept up without being told to, and she navigated the access junction without being guided. And when he stopped to confirm the path, she was already reading the wall markers herself. She knew this station, not vaguely. She knew it with the specific knowledge of someone who had studied it carefully, in advance, for exactly this situation. He filed this. He filed all of it. He moved. They were in the northeast spoke's service access with 90 seconds to spare, which was not a comfortable margin, but was a workable one. Harrow went through the maintenance hatch first, confirmed the shaft was clear, and held the hatch for the Queen, who went through it without assistance and moved down the shaft with the specific flexibility of a species that had been engineering their physiology for endurance over millennia. He sealed the hatch behind them. The sound of running footsteps in the hub corridor beyond receded as the insulation of the maintenance shaft absorbed it. "The chip reader is built into the diplomatic vessel's docking console," she said, from ahead of him in the shaft. Her voice was pitched low, carrying without projection. "TTS clean. When we board, the console will read the chip and transmit the secondary archive. The primary already went when you left Avera 7. He moved behind her in the shaft's dim emergency lighting. "When I left Avera 7, he said. "When you left the reception's communication range," she said. "The chip reads the network environment when activated. When you moved outside the station's communication bubble, which occurred when you boarded the transit ship, the primary transmission triggered. The Concordance Security Division's blind drop protocol received it approximately 11 minutes after you departed." He thought about this while he moved through the shaft. He thought about the past 32 hours and what they meant in the context of what she had just said. "The Concordance Security Division has had this information since 11 hours after you were taken." "Yes, and Sethris." Counselor Sethris was detained by the Security Division approximately 7 hours after the transmission was received. Based on the timing, his detention occurred while you were in Nereth's outer ring. She paused at a junction. "Read the access marks." Chose the right branch without hesitation. "The evidence was sufficient for immediate provisional detention. He has been held pending full concordance review since then." He considered this carefully, still moving.
"Vorath is reporting to a counselor who has been in Security Division custody
for the past 25 hours. Yes, Vorath does not know this. She navigated another junction. The Security Division operates its detentions under confidentiality protocol until formal charges are filed. No public communication, which means Vorath has been operating under the belief that he has a patron who is actually in custody. Yes, which means he has no extraction route, no political cover, no leverage beyond what is in this station. "Yes," she said, and then, because she was who she was, "That is approximately the point." He stopped walking. She did not stop immediately. She took 2 more steps before the change in his movement pattern registered in her peripheral attention, and she turned. She looked at him in the maintenance shaft's emergency lighting, which made her look like she was carved from amber and resolve. And she waited. The data chip transmitted the evidence to the security division when I left Avarice 7, he said. I was the carrier. I was the mechanism of transmission. You gave me the chip 3 weeks ago and placed me in the position by not telling me what it was or what it would do. That would cause me to carry it out of range at the critical moment, which was the moment you were taken. Which is the moment you arranged to be taken. Yes, she said. She said it without deflection. Without the diplomatic gloss she could have applied to it if she'd chosen to. She said it as the direct acknowledgement of a fact. You needed me to not know, he said. Yes. The word held something that was not quite weight and not quite apology, and was perhaps closest to the recognition of what it costs to do something necessary that the person it costs cannot be warned about. If you had known what the chip would do, you would have argued. You would have argued well, and I could not afford the outcome of that argument. He stood in the shaft for a moment. He thought about the 32 hours behind him and the chip in his pocket and the plan she had built around his ignorance of the plan and what it meant to be the mechanism in someone else's machine without being told you were the mechanism. He thought about what she had trusted him to do without telling him she was trusting him to do it. He thought about the specific quality of trust that sends someone into a situation that might kill them without telling them they're going. Because you need them to arrive at the choice without time for the choice to become a decision. And you believe that what they are is sufficient for what the situation requires. He thought about you have always been very good at your duties. James, we'll address this later, he said. We need to reach the docking arm. She read something in his voice, or in the stillness of his face, and she said quietly, with the directness she reserved for things she meant absolutely. Yes, we will. They moved. The northeast spoke's service access ran 40 meters to the outer ring's maintenance corridor, which connected to the secondary docking arm's service access. The Queen moved with him through the shaft without pause. The alarm patterns on the station's public channels audible through the thin walls of the maintenance infrastructure shifted as they moved. Vorath was redeploying, pulling security from the outer ring toward the hub exits, which was the standard response to a breach of the hub's inner section. He was concentrating his remaining forces inward. It was the correct instinct for containing a threat that had penetrated the hub. It was also the instinct that cleared the outer ring and the spoke corridor ahead of them.
Harrow was aware that Vorath was not going to be able to give the correct instinct.
Because the correct instinct and the correct response to a shock corps veteran in his installation were not the same thing. The correct response would have been to do the thing Vorath had not done at the beginning, which was to run. They reached the outer ring. The secondary docking arm was 60 meters down the outer ring's northeast section. The outer ring was, as predicted, essentially clear. 2 personnel visible in the corridor at the far end, 200 meters away and oriented inward toward the spoke junction. Harrow and the Queen went through the outer ring's maintenance channel instead of the main corridor, because 40 meters was preferable to 60 when the 40 meters were unwatched, and reached the secondary docking arm's service access. The vessel at the end of the arm was small, a 6-person diplomatic courier, concordance registered, in the colors of the Velhari Diplomatic Support franchise that contracted courier services to the concordance member missions. It did not look like anything except what it was registered as, which was the point of choosing it. The docking console was active. The Queen took the chip from his inner pocket. He let her take it, because she knew the sequence and he did not, and pressed it to the reader. The console ran a decrypt sequence, completed it in 4 seconds, and displayed a status screen. She read it and said, Secondary archive transmitted. The security division has full confirmation. Then the alert pattern on the station's channels changed again, and the sound from the docking arm's outer junction was the sound of people moving in from 2 directions at once. And Harrow assessed the timing and said, They're going to cut the arm. She looked at him. They'll destroy the vessel with us inside it. They're not sure we're in it yet. He moved toward the docking arm's inner access, which means Vorath is coming to confirm. She understood this. She followed him back to the arm's inner junction, and they were inside the arm's secondary equipment bay, a small pressurized space used for repair operations, with access to the arm's structural frame and the external hull. When the arm's inner access door opened and Commander Vorath came through it, with 4 security personnel behind him, and found the arm apparently empty. He stood in the arm's transit corridor and looked at the courier vessel's docking seal, and at the empty corridor, and at the access door to the secondary equipment bay, which was closed and locked. From Harrow's side, and his posture communicated the calculation of a person who was working out whether the vessel was occupied and whether cutting the arm was the appropriate response. Commander Vorath, the Queen said through the equipment bay's intercom, which was a standard safety feature on all Concordance docking arms. I think we should talk. The intercom crackled. Vorath's voice came back, tight, with the specific tension of a person who was recalculating rapidly. Queen Thessavane, come out of the equipment bay. I will, she said. After we've talked. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm in a more interesting position than you currently know, she said. Counselor Sethris was detained by the Concordance Security Division 25 hours ago. He is being held on provisional charges based on a 2-year evidence archive that I transmitted through the Concordance's blind drop protocol approximately 32 hours ago, when my butler left Avarice 7. A pause, measured and deliberate. The archive documents Sethris's of 3 assassination attempts on Concordance representatives who supported human membership over the past 9 years, as well as his financial transfers to the Vreth Syndicate for operational support. Including this operation specifically. Silence from the corridor. Your patron has been in custody for more than a day, she continued. The leverage you believed this operation would provide was invalidated before you docked at this station. You have no extraction route, no political cover, and no benefit remaining from this mission. You have, however, a choice. Vorath's voice, when it came back, had the quality of someone who was making calculations very quickly. You're lying. You can verify it on any Concordance network terminal, she said. The Security Division's Provisional Detention Register is publicly accessible. Search for Sethris. You will find him. Another measured pause. This would be a good use of the next few minutes. There was a much longer silence. In the equipment bay, Harrow watched the intercom display and watched the Queen, who stood with her hands folded and her spine straight, and the expression she wore when things were proceeding according to the schedule she had intended. From the corridor, the sound of a terminal accessing a public Concordance network. This faced several seconds of search and verification, then a sound that was not quite anything that required a specific name. The sound of a person's operational framework encountering a fact that does not fit within it and is too large to dismiss. You built this before we took you, Vorath said. Not a question. I built it over 2 years, she said. This operation was the final step. I needed Sethris to authorize one overt act, something on record, something unambiguous, that my archive could be attached to. Your operation provided that. Thank you. You used yourself as bait. I used the situation as it presented itself, she said. Sethris needed me neutralized before the summit completed. He would move against me, given sufficient provocation and opportunity. I arranged the provocation and the opportunity. She paused. I also arranged the response. In the equipment bay, Harrow looked at this last phrase. He thought about being the response. He thought about the 32 hours behind him, and the chip, and the carefully maintained ignorance, and the specific kind of trust that sends someone in without telling them they're going. He held these thoughts in the particular way he had learned to hold things that required careful consideration rather than immediate reaction, and he set them aside for later, because the situation was not concluded. Vorath said, "The butler, my butler," she said, with a precision that was quiet and absolute, "who is standing approximately 2 meters to my left." A long silence. Then, "What are you?" And this question was addressed through the equipment bay's intercom, past the Queen, to the space where Harrow was standing. And Harrow did not answer it immediately, because it was a question he had been asking himself in various forms for 9 years. And he had arrived at an answer he felt reasonably confident in. And the answer was this. He was a person who had been many things, and who was capable of being most of them at need, and who had spent 7 years choosing the version of himself that built things rather than the version that removed them, and who was going to continue making that choice as long as the choice was available. He said, "Open the arm." Another silence. Then, "If I open the arm, you walk away. If you open the arm," Harrow said, "you go into Concordance Security Division custody with 43 counts of security personnel assault, added to the existing charges. Instead of 43 counts of assault and whatever they charge for attempting to destroy a diplomatic vessel with a Velhari queen and her household staff inside it. He kept his voice level. Commander Vorath, you are out of moves. Open the arm. The arm opened. They walked out. Vorath and his 4 security personnel were standing in the outer junction, and they were not armed. Or rather, they were armed, but the arms were not raised, because Vorath had done the final calculation and had reached the conclusion that Dren had reached several hours earlier, which was that the operational window for different outcomes had closed. Harrow moved past the security detail with the queen on his left, and as he passed Vorath looked at him with an expression that was part calculation and part something else. The something else that Dren would later describe in her deposition as the first time I have ever seen Commander Vorath uncertain. And Vorath said, quietly, the 7th Squad. What's left of it? Harrow said. They boarded the courier vessel. He set the docking sequence, ran the departure authorization through the diplomatic channel that opened automatically when the chip's secondary archive transmitted, and the vessel disconnected from Nareth Station's secondary arm with the quiet efficiency of an authorized diplomatic departure. No alarms, no pursuit vectors. The station fell away behind them. He sat in the courier pilot's position and ran the transit calculations. The Queen sat in the co-pilot seat, which was not her usual position, and was therefore an indication that she was in a mode she did not use often, which was the mode of someone who was not performing a role but simply being present. After 3 minutes of transit calculation, he said, "You needed me not to know." "Yes," she said, "because I would have argued, because you would have argued well, and because the argument would have been correct on its merits, and because I could not afford the outcome of a correct argument." She looked at the transit display. "The operation required you to carry the chip without knowing you were carrying the chip. Because a person carrying a chip they know they're carrying moves differently than a person carrying a chip they don't know they're carrying. Security systems designed to detect deliberate transmission would not flag you. Sethris had such systems." She paused. "He does not trust people who are not carrying anything, but he trusts people who are carrying something they do not know they're carrying. And you needed me to come here," he said. "I needed someone here who could do what you did," she said, "in 32 hours, alone, in an installation they had never been in, with no resources, no backup, and no plan I had given them." She paused again, and the pause was longer than her pauses usually were. "I know what I asked you to be. I am not unaware of what that cost." He said nothing. He looked at the transit display and let the silence hold for a moment. Then he said, "Your hands are steady." "Yes, mine are too," he said. He looked at them. He had not expected them to be, had expected the adrenaline resolution and the after cost that came with the after. The specific exhaustion of having been a specific thing for 32 hours. They were steady. They were more steady than they had been in 7 years. He held this observation without deciding what to do with it. That's not necessarily good news. She looked at him then. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was reading carefully, with the full attention of someone for whom reading carefully was a foundational professional skill. "It means you're still here," she said. "That's news of some kind." He thought about this. He thought about 7 years of table settings, and beverage temperatures, and diplomatic receptions, and the quiet, satisfying work of being useful to someone doing something important. He thought about 32 hours in the dark of a hostile station, with his hands going still and something settling into position that had been waiting in that position for a long time. He thought about the gap between those two things, and whether the gap was actually as large as he'd been assuming. He looked at the transit display. "We're going to be talking about this," he said, at length. "Yes," she said, "we are." And she said it without the diplomatic precision, without the calibration, in the simple, direct way she used for things she intended to address as honestly. "I think it will be a useful conversation." He set the transit heading and leaned back in the pilot's seat and watched the stars resolve from blur to points as the vessel entered stable transit. His hands were on his knees. They were still. He did not yet know what that meant. He was going to find out. The Concordance Security Division's courier met them 4 hours out from Nareth, which meant the Security Division had been tracking the diplomatic vessel's transit course since the moment it departed the Syndicate's secondary arm, which meant they had been anticipating the departure. which meant they had known. The Queen was on the vessel before they could have confirmed it through standard tracking. Harrow noted this. He filed it under the heading of things the Queen arranged in advance that are becoming clearer in retrospect, which was becoming a substantial file. The division courier was professional and careful, and treated the Queen with the specific courtesy of an organization that was acutely aware of what she had just handed them. A 2-year evidence archive with full concordance legal authentication, documenting the funding of 3 assassination attempts and the financing of a criminal operation against a sitting member candidate's primary diplomatic advocate. The documentation was complete. It was the kind of complete that came from someone who had been building it with the intention of it being complete, rather than assembling it under time pressure, the division's lead officer said. At one point in the handoff process, Your Majesty, the scope of this archive isn't stopped. Looking for the right word, and the Queen said thorough, and the officer said yes. That is the word in a tone that suggested thorough was perhaps the understatement of the political year. They arrived at the Concordant Central Station at the 96th hour, 2 hours before the summit's procedural recess was scheduled to expire. The Security Division had maintained confidentiality on Sethrus's detention throughout. No public communication, no summit notification, and the summit delegates had been managing the Velhari Queen's unexpected brief absence with the careful diplomatic creativity that galactic politics required when a major participant in a significant treaty process went missing, and the host organization was not yet prepared to explain why. Vorath and his remaining Nareth personnel were in division custody, transported on a separate vessel. Harrow had not seen Vorath again after leaving Nareth Station, and did not expect to see him before the formal proceedings. He was aware that Vorath's processing would include statements, and that some of those statements would be about him, and that there were aspects of those statements that were going to create complications that he had not yet had time to think through. He had time to think through them now. He used it. The formal sessions of the Galactic Concordance High Council opened at the 72-hour mark after the summit's recess extended by 48 hours on procedural grounds that nobody had explained publicly, and everybody had understood politically in the main chamber of the Concordance's Avarice 7 installation, with High Speaker Orvith Khan of the Theresi Collective presiding. Queen Thesivane entered in the same ocean blue gown she had worn to the reception, because she had not had access to anything else, and had chosen, which Harrow recognized as a choice and not an oversight, to wear that choice openly. Her household staff, Harrow included, was positioned in the gallery above the chamber floor. From the gallery, he watched the session open, watched the Velhari delegation take their positions, watched Councillor Sethrus's empty seat draw attention it had not been intended to draw, and waited. The session had been open for 11 minutes when Vorath's legal representation submitted a statement to the presiding record. Harrow had been expecting this, though not with this timing. The statement was submitted under the Concordance's Operational Disclosure Protocol, which allowed detained parties in pending cases to submit statements to the record of active sessions if those statements bore on ongoing matters before the Council. The statement, as read into the record by High Speaker Orvith Khan, with the careful neutrality of someone who had been a Concordance High Speaker for 30 years and had heard most things at least once before, asserted the following: that an individual identified in Syndicate operational records as a member of the 7th Squad, Shock Corps, 3rd Human Expeditionary Force, had operated within the Vreth Syndicate's Nevreth Station installation without Concordance authorization, and in doing so had operated as an active military asset of humanity's military apparatus, which under the Galactic Concordance Arms Limitation and Force Projection Treaty required prior notification, registration, and authorization before deployment in any space claimed by or adjacent to a Concordance member entity's operations, and that the absence of such notification and registration constituted a violation of the Arms Treaty on the part of humanity's government, and that this violation bore directly on the question of humanity's fitness for Concordance membership, and that the Council should accordingly suspend the admission proceedings pending investigation. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. Harrow sat in the gallery and listened to the not quiet and thought about what he was looking at, which was not Vorath's legal strategy. That was obvious and had been obvious the moment Dren had identified what he was and what the implications of what he was would be in a legal context.
But rather the specific mechanism by which the plan that he had been the instrument of was now creating a problem for the plan it had been designed to solve.
The plan had removed Sethris. The plan had prevented the abdication. The plan had secured the evidence. The plan had not, apparently, accounted for the arms treaty, or possibly it had, and he had not been told about that part either. He looked at the chamber floor, where the Queen was sitting in the Velhari delegation's position with her spine straight and her expression precisely calibrated and her hands folded in her lap, and he watched her listen to the not quiet of the chamber with the stillness of someone who has already read a book and is now watching others read it for the first time. High Speaker Orvath Khan restored order and opened the matter for response. The Velhari delegation's lead counsel began the formal response, which was careful and thorough and addressed several of the arms treaty's provisions directly. Harrow listened. He noted the arguments. He noted the gaps in the arguments. He identified one gap in particular that was structural rather than procedural, a gap that the Velhari delegation's legal team had not addressed because it required the specific knowledge of what he was and what he had done in what context, and that knowledge was not something the delegation's legal team had been given access to. He looked at the Queen. She was looking at the High Speaker. She was listening to her own counsel's arguments. She was not, from what he could read at this distance, doing the specific thing she did when she had a plan for something and was waiting for the plan's next stage. The fingers on her folded hands were moving slightly, a micro-gesture he had documented in year 4, which she made when she was working out a problem she had not yet resolved. She did not have a plan for this part. He thought about this for about 45 seconds. Then he stood up, because the chamber's gallery had visitor communication access to the floor through the Concordance's standard democratic process protocol, and submitted a request to speak. High Speaker Orvath Khan, who had been a Concordance High Speaker for 30 years and had genuinely seen most things at least once, looked up at the gallery request indicator with an expression that communicated that this specific situation, a domestic servant of the delegation under discussion, requesting floor access in the middle of a treaty admission crisis, was nevertheless new. She acknowledged the request with the procedural correctness that 30 years of high speakership had made automatic, and said, "The Council recognizes the representative from the Velhari household staff." From the floor, he could feel the Queen's attention shift to him. He did not look at her yet. He spoke carefully, in the measured way that the TTS optimized delivery of complex legal arguments required, clearly, with deliberate pacing, with the specific care for rhythm that ensured every word landed exactly as intended. He said that the Arms Treaty's Force Projection Clause, under which Vorath's statement was filed, applied to the deployment of military assets by signatory governments in spaces claimed by or adjacent to Concordance member operations. He said that this clause had a documented interpretation history of 42 years that required, for the clause to apply, that the deployment be government-authorized and government-directed. He said that his presence at Nareth Station was not government-authorized and not government-directed. He said that he had entered Nareth Station without informing any human government authority, without receiving any government directive, and without any government knowledge of his presence, before, during, or after the operation. He said that he had done so in his capacity as a private individual, in his professional capacity, as a member of the Velhari Queen's household staff. At the instruction, he looked at the Queen here, and she was looking at him, and her expression was the expression of someone who was paying very close attention of his employer. He said that he was, as of 33 hours ago, a private individual, formerly military, currently employed in domestic service, who had made a choice his employer had asked him to make, and that the Arms Treaty's Force Projection Clause no more applied to his presence at Nareth than it applied to the presence of any other private individual acting in the employment of a galactic diplomatic figure. He said that the question before the Council was not whether humanity had deployed a military asset without authorization. The question was whether the Velhari Queen's household was authorized to include human personnel who had a military history. He said, "There is no provision in any concordance document that prohibits former military personnel from private employment." he said, if such a provision existed. A significant portion of the galaxy's domestic and security staffing would be in violation of it, he said. The statement submitted by Vorath's legal representation was an argument about what I am, not about what I did. And what I did was go find my employer. The chamber was quiet when he stopped speaking. Not the previous not quiet. A different kind of quiet. High Speaker Orvith Khan looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and was genuinely thinking. Then she said, "The council will recess for deliberation." The chamber recessed. The Velhari delegation remained in position. Harrow went back to the gallery. The queen came to him. She did not come to the gallery, which would have been visible to the chamber, and therefore political. She came to the anteroom behind the gallery access, which was a private space used for delegation consultations, and which is where Harrow had gone after the floor access closed. She came in without knocking. She had never knocked. In 7 years of entering rooms he was in, because knocking implied uncertainty, and she did not operate from uncertainty, and closed the door behind her. She looked at him, she said. The arms treaty argument was not part of my plan. I know, he said. I did not anticipate Vorath's statement. I know. She was quiet for a moment. He had seen her without a plan before twice in 7 years, in situations she had not been able to fully prepare for, and both times she had managed it with the composure she brought to everything. But this was different. This was not the composure of someone managing an unexpected situation. This was the face of someone who was standing in an anteroom with the person they had used as an instrument in a plan they had built alone, and who had just, without being asked, stepped into the gap the plan had left. Her expression held something she did not often let hold in her expression, which was the unmediated version of what she was actually feeling. She said, "James, Your Majesty, the argument you made was..." She stopped! She tried again. "You were not required to do that." "No," he said. "I wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment in the anteroom, with the sound of the chamber's recess coming faintly through the walls. "I owe you a conversation," she said. "I owe you several." "Yes, you do." He said it without edge. He said it as a straightforward fact, which was how it was. "But not right now." She nodded, once, and then, with the specific directness she used, only for things she meant without qualification. "I am sorry for what it cost to carry this." He looked at her. He thought about the 32 hours at Nerith, and the still hands in the maintenance shaft, and the thing that had settled into position. He thought about what it had cost and what it had confirmed, and what it had changed in him and what it had not. He thought about what apology meant when it came from someone who had done a necessary thing that hurt another person, and whether the thing being necessary changed what the apology meant, and whether the apology changed what the thing being necessary meant. He said, "I know." They went back to the chamber. The deliberation took 41 minutes. When the High Speaker returned and the session resumed, Harrow was in the gallery, and the Queen was at the delegation table, and the chamber held the specific quality of quiet that preceded important things. High Speaker Orvith Khan said, "The Council has reviewed the submitted statement and the response offered by the member of Velhari household staff. The Council finds that the Arms Treaty's forced projection clause requires government authorization and direction for applicability. The activity described does not meet this threshold. The submitted statement is noted for the record and does not constitute grounds for suspension of the admission proceedings." A pause, in the way that High Speakers paused for the weight of things. The Council will proceed to the final ratification vote on the question of human admission to the Galactic Concordance. The vote took 8 minutes. Harrow sat in the gallery and watched it, and he thought about what 31 years looked like arriving, which was mostly that it looked like people making marks in a record in sequence, one after another, which was perhaps not what 31 years of effort deserved as its visual equivalent, but was what it got, because the universe was not theatrical in its moments. The result was 31 votes in favor, 3 abstentions, and 0 votes against. 0 was the number that mattered. Councillor Sethrus's seat had been counted as an abstention for procedural reasons. The 3 abstentions were the 3 species who had been calculating their position relative to the resource agreements for the past 6 months and had landed, ultimately, on a position that they could live with. 0 against was 31 years of a woman's life arriving at its completion. Harrow did not attend the reception that followed. He had attended the one before, which had been sufficient. He was in the station's maintenance bay level 4, port section, the part of the station where the structural systems connected to the outer ring and which required occasional manual adjustment, because the docking arms put lateral stress on the connections during high-traffic periods. When the Queen found him 2 hours after the vote, he had found a fastener coupling on one of the docking arm connections that was running loose, a genuine maintenance issue, not invented, and he was tightening it with the tool from the standard kit he kept in his jacket pocket. Because it was loose and he was there, and that was reason enough. She stood at the maintenance bay's entrance for a moment and watched him work. Then she came in and sat on a supply crate on the other side of the connection housing and said nothing. He tightened the coupling, checked the adjacent connections, found them good, replaced the tool. After a while, she said, "I have something for you." He looked up. She held out a data slate, a different one from the chip, a simple display slate, the kind used for document access. "This is from the Kadrith archive," she said. "The public access section that was opened under the terms of the peace agreement. It was filed 10 years ago. I found it 2 years ago." He took the slate. He looked at it. It was a compilation of testimony statements, filed with the Concordance Archive, under the peace agreement's documentation requirement. The statements were from Kadrith military personnel who had been present at Velkath during the 7th Squad's engagement. There were 47 of them. They were not short. He looked at the header of the first one, and then he read it. The Kadrith who had filed this statement had been a junior logistics officer in the fortress at the time of the engagement. She had been in a section of the fortress adjacent to the 7th Squad's advance during the second day of the 31-hour operation. She had been alive because she had been a logistics officer and not a combat officer, and because the squad had not cleared the logistics sections in the order that would have brought them through her location. She had written the statement 10 years after the engagement, in the flat, careful language of someone who had spent 10 years deciding whether to write it. The statement described what she had seen from the adjacency, the squad's movement through the fortress, the specific quality of its advance, the things it had done and not done. Near the end, she wrote about the Day 2 wounded Kadrith military personnel incapacitated during the engagement but still alive in the cleared sections, and what the remaining squad member had done, which was to give them water. She had used the Kadrith word for water, which was also the Kadrith word for mercy in one of its older usages, a double meaning that she noted and that the Concordance translator had preserved. She wrote, "They were afraid of us. They should have been afraid of us. We were afraid of them and had reason to be. But the one who remained came back through the cleared section and gave the wounded water. And I watched from the logistics junction. And I did not understand this. And I have spent 10 years trying to understand this. And what I have arrived at is not understanding exactly, but something adjacent to it, which is that the thing that could do what they did in that fortress was also the thing that came back and gave the wounded water. And these were not separate things. They were the same thing. There were 46 more statements. He did not read them all there. He sat in the maintenance bay of Avaris 7's level 4 port section with the data slate in his hands, and he read 3 of them. And then he sat with the weight of them for a while, which was a different sitting than most of the sitting he had done in the past 3 days. The Queen did not say anything while he sat. After some time, he looked up. He said, "I didn't know they'd written this." "No," she said. "You've had this for 2 years." "Yes." He looked at the slate. He thought about what it meant that she had carried this for 2 years and had given it to him now, in a maintenance bay, 2 hours after humanity's admission to the Galactic Concordance, when he was tightening a loose coupling. He thought about what the statement meant and what the 46 others meant and what it meant to have someone tell you, 10 years later, that the thing you did not understand about yourself was visible from the outside in a form you had not known to look for. He thought about the still hands in the maintenance shaft at Nerith. He thought about the thing that had settled into position. He thought about the table settings and the beverage temperatures and the 7 years of useful, ordinary, satisfying work, and the 32 hours that had happened alongside those 7 years, in the way that everything you are capable of being happens alongside everything you have chosen to be. Waiting. He thought about the Kadrith logistics officer and what she had spent 10 years arriving at, which was something adjacent to understanding. He thought that adjacent to understanding was where he was too. He put on his service gloves. He stood up. He looked at the Queen. "I'm not leaving your service," he said. She looked at him. She held very still, with the stillness of someone who had prepared for a different answer than the one they'd just received. "I considered it," he said. "After the arms treaty statement, I thought it might resolve the complication." "It would not have resolved it," she said, quietly. "The complication exists regardless of your continued service. I know. That's why I'm not leaving." He looked at the slate, and then back at her. The thing I was at Nerith, it didn't go away when I took this position. It's been here the whole time. It's part of what makes me good at the job." He paused. "I spent 7 years pretending there was a line between the version of me that noticed the 4 agents at the door and the version that tightens a loose coupling. There isn't. It's the same attention, the same version." He folded his hands. "I'd like to continue in my position, if you'll have me." The Queen sat on the supply crate in the maintenance bay, with the sounds of the station around them and the data slate on the floor between them, and she looked at him with the look she had, the one that was full attention and careful reading. And then she said, "James, you were the one thing in the plan that I did not have to arrange." He waited. "I arranged everything else," she said. "The archive, the chip, the transmission sequence, Sethrus's provocation window, the diplomatic vessel at Nerith's secondary arm. I planned every component I could plan." She paused, with the pause she used when she was being precise about something important. "I did not arrange you. You have been, for 7 years. Something you are without my arrangement. That is not a thing I take for granted. I want you to know that." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about 7 years of table settings and the 32 hours at Nerith and the 46 statements in the archive and the still hands and the thing that had settled into position. He thought about what it meant to be known by someone who had known you long enough to know the gap between what you showed and what you were, and to have thought carefully about both. He said, "Then I'll continue with my duties." And she said, "Yes," and the word held. In the quiet of the maintenance bay, the specific quality of something that had been true for 7 years and had now been said. He picked up the data slate and put it in his inner jacket pocket, where the chip had been. They went back to the chamber. The post-vote reception was still running when they returned. These things ran for hours, because they were the social infrastructure through which 31 years of political relationships were redistributed into the new configuration that humanity's admission created. And there was a great deal of redistribution to accomplish. The Queen went to it. Harrow went to his position, which was the position at the edge of the room, from which he watched the entire space. And he stood there with his tray and his white jacket and the gloves and the layered invisibility. And he watched. He watched the Velhari Queen of 211 years take her first reception as a member of the Concordance, which looked from the outs exactly like every other reception he had ever attended with her, and which was, in fact, different in every way that mattered from the inside. He watched the 31 years of accumulated momentum find its final form in the way other people moved toward her and the way she received them. He watched the room's political cognometry shift in real time as humanity's admission moved from anticipated to actual. He noticed 3 people whose positioning patterns across the room were worth tracking. He noted the fire exit routes and the service corridors and the catering station placement and the access protocols for the level above and the level below. He noted where the Concordance Security Division's plainclothes personnel were standing, which was 6 positions around the room's perimeter, and where they were looking, which was everywhere except the position he'd taken, because he was still, even here, the domestic staff. He thought about the 46 statements in the archive. He thought about the Cadrith logistics officer and what she had spent 10 years arriving at. He thought that he had spent 9 years arriving at what she had arrived at in 10, and that the marge was not a victory exactly, but was something. His hands were at rest at his sides, not still in the way they had been still at Nerith, with the specific quality of a thing settling into position, still in the way that things were still when they were where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to be doing, present and functional and, in their particular way, at peace with the conditions of their existence. The Queen moved through the room. Somewhere in it, humanity was being welcomed into the galactic community, and the 31 years that had built to this point were resolving into what came next, which was going to be difficult and complex and interesting, in the specific way that things were interesting when they involved 31 species trying to share the same political space for the first time. That was going to take considerable management. He watched the room. The butler of the Velhari queen stood at his position and watched the room and thought, adjacent to understanding is somewhere.